I am just so grateful to be here today, to be here with you, to be here in this beautiful setting. And I'm so grateful for the priestesses and high priestesses who are here to support this and make this day a very special one for all of you. And I'm so grateful for my teachers, from whom I have learned why and how to embody the divine feminine, and from whom I have received the shamanic priestess and the Magdalene high priestess initiations and transmissions. Like many of you, I grew up in a motherless religion, and God was male. And when God is male, male is God. So we're going to play a little game to start us off, to help explore what some of the invisible injuries of this patriarchal model might be. So I'm going to ask you to stand up if you've ever experienced any of the following. When you were growing up, most of the scripture stories you heard about at home or church and the history lessons you heard about or read about at school were about men and their deeds and journeys. Oh, many of us are standing. Stay standing if most of the stories that included women were about their marriages or their ability to conceive, bear children, and rear children. Remain standing or stand up if this next part was true for you. Your dad presided in the home over your mom. Oh, wonderful. You saw or heard, as you were growing up or became an adult, you saw or heard males being praised or rewarded for being strong, and women being praised or rewarded for being sensitive to the needs of others. When you heard the term "like a girl," it was used in a derogatory way. Women and girls were put on pedestals as the creators of life and taught that being a mother was the most important role they would ever have. The majority of the talk about parenting, homemaking, and nurturing children revolved around females and did not include much about men and fatherhood. Your mother and her daughters did more of the housework in your home than did your fathers and mothers. When you saw men or boys being assertive, they were praised for being strong. When you saw a female acting in similar ways, she was called aggressive or a bitch. You noticed that women were, and still are, being paid less than men for the same job even when they work harder than men. If you have ever experienced that gender inequalities were not easily acknowledged by male leaders or teachers, do we ever see that happening? You have ever seen or heard advertisements in any of the media that demeaned women? You have ever seen or heard women being blamed for displeasing men or for their children's problems? You realize that in popular media and in advertising, it's okay to portray women as sex objects, but not men. Women are portrayed as young, slim, overwhelmingly white, conforming to narrow standards of beauty. And last one, you have ever felt discouraged because male-led organizations did not welcome the sharing of autonomy, power, and authority with women. Okay, so we can all sit down. Thank you for playing that game with me. So lots of us have actually experienced the result of the one up, one down power structure, because when God is male and male is God, there's that subliminal feeling of he is good and I'm not as good. It's a one up, one down dominator model that gives preference to whiteness, maleness, and masculine attributes. But thanks to archaeologists and historians, in the last 50 years, we've discovered that 3,000 years ago, before God was male, the divine was actually worshipped as female. So today we're going to do an archaeological dig in our collective consciousness. And we're going to discover what was matriarchy like for people who lived back then. So what would it have been like for you, for me, for our children, if we had lived in ancient times? Now, by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the archetypes of the goddess? Any of the archetypes of the goddess? Any of her faces? Okay, so some of us are familiar. The biggest difference, and we'll talk a little bit about the many, many faces of the goddess. As you can see, there are many, many depictions. This is a replica of the Venus of Willendorf, who is thousands and thousands of years old, the goddess of Thrace. So all of these cultures all over the world, because before we had as much travel and obviously the internet as we do today, each different culture created the divine in their own image. Okay, and that image was female. So the biggest difference for those of us who were living in ancient times was something called the anima mundi. How many of you have ever heard that Latin term before? Does anybody know what it means? Is anybody able to explain it? The anima mundi, and it was, pardon?
I think it means image of the world, spirit of the world.
Spirit of the world, soul of the world. So back in ancient times, the word for soul quite literally meant the soul of the world. Like our soul, yours and mine, wasn't privatized. It wasn't individuated. It belonged to Mother Earth, and every creature, every organism that lived on the earth. We were all a part of the anima mundi. We were all a part of the soul of the world. And so I want you to think for just a minute about what that paradigm would result in. Instead of a one-up, one-down relationship with everything, with God on the top and man under, and women and children and plants and animals and insects, in that hierarchy of beings, we had a partnering because we were all part of the same soul. It wasn't actually, so for thousands of years, this was the paradigm. Even after the advent of patriarchy, Plato still aligned with this, calling the anima mundi the most important component of Neoplatonic systems. And the Stoics believed it to be the only one vital force in the universe. But by the Middle Ages, St. Augustine privatized the soul. And now to us, when you hear the word soul, you think of your own individual, distinct, separate, unique soul, separate from everyone else's. In patriarchy, the paradigm is, I think, therefore I am. But in matrilineal cultures, the paradigm is, I am because we are. Say that with me.
I am because we are.
Very different paradigm. So in the year 2000, in January of that year, after 45 years as a devout Mormon, I graduated myself from the church. And I began a spiritual exploration that continues today. Now, I've done yoga since I was 14 years old, and one of my first radical acts was to join a Kundalini Yoga teacher certification. And during that process, my yoga teacher said, "You carry the energy of the goddess Kali." And I said, the god, what? Who? And he said, "Kali." And I said, I don't know who Kali is, and I've never heard the term goddess before. And so he gave me 3 books on Kali and said, "Go home and read these." And I was astounded that this was my first introduction to pre-patriarchal anything. And I was absolutely astounded. So for those of you who don't, how many of you know Kali? I present a very lunar, feminine presence. I mean, I have this very soft, easy, sweet, mothering way about me, and I just can't help that. But when you really get to know me, if you happen to be in danger or are in need of protection, my fierceness comes out. And what he was saying that he saw in me was the goddess Kali's. Now, the goddess Kali is the goddess of death and destruction. And I'm actually going to pass her around. If you look carefully, you'll be frightened. If you look carefully, you'll see swords and knives and skulls and blood, right? Okay, she's called the goddess of death and destruction. But by the Hindus in India, she is considered the most compassionate of all the goddesses. And they have many. They have a pantheon of goddesses. And why? Because she is the one with the sword of truth who stands ready to quickly and mercifully sever the truth from the illusion in your life. Whatever is really not serving you, whatever is a lie, whatever is not really the truth of who you are, she stands ready to cut that away from you as quickly as possible. And they revere and they love her. And do you know that Calcutta, the city of Calcutta, was named after her? And the reason that Mother Teresa built her ashram for the dying in Calcutta is because the Hindus believe that Mother Teresa is a reincarnation of Kali. So that was my first introduction to the pantheon of goddesses, to the archetypes. My very next teacher, her name is Jean Raffa, and she wrote a wonderful book. I studied with her in Orlando. She's a Jungian, and she wrote a wonderful book called Healing the Sacred Divide, Making Peace with Ourselves, Each Other, and the World. And she believes, and I agree with her, that until we learn to embody these archetypes of the divine feminine, until we bring forth the gifts of the divine feminine instead of just the masculine, we won't be able to have peace within ourselves, in our communities, or on our planet. In the courses I took with her, she talked about the masculine faces of God, and there are many. Can some of you name some of the masculine faces of God? Jehovah. Allah. Jesus. Buddha. Thank you. There are many. So, and if we go back before patriarchy, there were also many of the faces of the divine masculine, because you can't have Shakti without Shiva. And so there are many faces of the divine masculine. But Jean Raffa believes that all of the faces of the divine masculine bring forth gifts in us, qualities that when we embody them, help us along the lines of self-preservation. And she believes that all of the qualities and gifts, when we embody them of the divine feminine, help us align with species preservation. And we can't have a peaceful and happy and healthy and holy society and world without both. We've got to have both. So the symbol in the center of the circle, these symbols, the Christ, the Magdalene, the sacred union of the couple, represents when you bring the masculine archetypes together within yourself with the feminine archetypes. So why study the divine feminine? Why would that be important? Well, when we learn about the goddesses, when we learn their different names and faces and study their archetypes, we bring what might be an intuitive understanding. Oh, Kali, she's the goddess of death and destruction. She's comfortable with that dying stuff. But we take that understanding when we really study them, and then we bring the awareness into our emotional, our physical, our mental, our intellectual, our spiritual lives, our spiritual realms. We get a feeling, a visceral sense of what it means to express those qualities when they are needed in our own bodies, relationships, and lives. So what I want to talk about is how would it change things for you if you understood the divine feminine in a deeper way, if you welcomed the divine feminine more into your life? Well, the first thing that would change is your physical relationship with your body. So, remember when we talked about the anima mundi, and we talked about the soul of the world, your soul being connected to the soul of the world. That wasn't just a concept. That wasn't just an idea. And if you and I had grown up in this day and age in any matrilineal, matrifocal, indigenous culture, we would have been taught from birth to do something that I'm going to teach you to do now. So, and Donna intimated this when she did the opening prayer. If you would put both feet on the floor. So we've all got a spine, and the yogis call the central nerve channel of the spine the Sushumna. And in our bodies, that would be the Holy of Holies. Your body, you've heard that your body is a temple. Maybe some of you have heard that. The Sushumna is the Holy of Holies. And so what we want, when we're sitting, is we want our hips and our shoulders to be stacked, one on top. So for those of you, scoot back in the chair a little bit or sit up, and we want the chest to be lifted. And then bring all of your attention to the base of your spine. And just imagine a warm light or a flame. And we'll let that imagined flame at the base of your spine, we'll let that represent your own sacred Kundalini life force. So I'm going to teach you how to receive from Mother Earth like all of the plants do with their root system. And like all of the animals do, especially animals that have a tail. So I want you to just bring your attention to the base of your spine and imagine or pretend that you have a tail, a taproot, dropping directly down through the chair and sinking down through the floor and the foundation of the building and dropping all the way down to the core of Mother Earth. Just imagine your taproot going all the way down to the core of the earth, the first dimension. And now imagine, bring your attention back to the warm light at the base of your spine, and imagine that two more roots are flowing down from the base of your spine, down your legs, flowing out the soles of your feet, and dropping through the floor and the foundation. And these roots are going to do the same thing that the roots of a mighty tree do. As they go deep under this land, they're going to go deep and wide, anchoring you in to this land, to this part of Roswell. Now, imagine, think of, feel the love that you have for our precious planet. Just bring your attention to the love and gratitude that you have for our planet and for this beautiful part of our planet, the United States, the state of Georgia, the city of Roswell. And imagine that love and that gratitude dropping down from your taproot and sinking into the core of the earth and dropping down through your other roots and sinking into this land. Just imagine Mother Earth, this land, receiving your attention, receiving your appreciation. And in return, she sends a steady and powerful stream of life force, the same life force that fuels the trees and the flowers and the animals. Imagine it traveling up from the core of the earth directly up into your spine. Imagine it traveling up from the roots connected to this land, traveling up your legs, entering the base of your spine. Imagine that as this life force, this yin, divine feminine power, rises up, it activates your own Kundalini life force, allowing that to travel up the Sushumna in a brilliant flash of light. Beautiful. So we would have been taught from birth how to do this, and we would have been taught to do it every morning when we awake and every night, because the body needs life force to fuel itself during the day and to repair itself at night. How many of you do this kind of thing on a regular basis? Some of us. Okay, wonderful. So the physical relationship we have with our bodies, if we had been born in a divine feminine worshiping, honoring culture, would have been to connect our bodies to the body of our mother. Does anyone know what the Native Americans call trees? Standing people. Yes, standing people. Now think about that for just a moment. They called animals by their animal names, right? But they called trees standing people. They believe that every animal, every insect, every life form has a gift, or they call it medicine, to offer us. And the medicine of trees is to show us, what did they call humans? Does anybody know? Two-leggeds. We're two-leggeds. We walk about the earth on two legs. We don't have roots that sink us in. But the trees are standing people. So the medicine or the gift of the trees was to show the two-leggeds how to root ourselves. And there's another piece to that, and we'll do that in the meditation of how else would understanding and embodying the divine feminine change things for the body, for the physical experience. Well, we have been so indoctrinated by patriarchy in our Western culture, in this one-up, one-down hierarchy, that we actually, without confronting it or even thinking about it, most of us are in a dominator relationship with our own bodies. We, in this country, come from Puritans and patriarchs who believed that spirit and matter are opposites, that the body is carnal, sensual, and devilish, and to be eschewed in favor of the spiritual pursuit of gaining the kingdom of God. But to the ancients, there was no dichotomy. These two were not polar opposites. The physical element of earth that includes the body of the earth and our physical bodies and everything that has matter, that was an expression of spirit, which holds everything together. So there was no making the body less than or making the body worse than spirit. So if you believe that spirit is the opposite of matter, then the earth and our bodies are prisons. But if you believe that this physical realm, including our bodies, is just simply an expression of spirit, then you're going to feel the sacredness of your own body and the body of our mother. Now, my tantric yoga education taught me that we are 6 sensory creatures. What are the senses? Let's list them. Touch, sight, hearing, taste, sound. What's the 6th sense?
Intuition.
The 6th sense is here. Yes, the 6 senses are intuition. So if we've got all 5 senses open, our smell, our taste, our hearing, our touch, if we've got all the senses open, and we're living a full-on tantric life, automatically that 6th sense of our intuition is going to open. But there's something else besides just the intuition. When we're living a full-on 6 sensory life, our sensuality, which is living with the 6 senses, our sexuality, which is having a sexual expression that feels right to us, and our spirituality are inseparably braided together. And there's no shame or making sexuality or sensuality bad or wrong. To the ancients, sensuality and sexuality are sacred channels through which divine love flows. So these are just a few of the ways that it might make a difference to us today to embody the aspects, the archetypes of the divine feminine. What about the water element, which governs the emotional domain? How would it make a difference to us in our emotions, in our emotional life, in our relational life, if we embody the divine feminine? Well, for this one, I want to refer to a wonderful book, which I highly recommend to all of you, called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And a lot of my study of let's see, where's the book? The quote that Sharon read from David Abram is from the book The Spell of the Sensuous, who is a researcher and a wonderful writer, and he's traveled to many indigenous matrifocal cultures. And so he understands that non-writing, oral cultures have a different, not just physical experience with their senses, but when we're living with that 6th sense of intuition, we have a capacity that we don't have when our awareness rests just in our head. So a focus on writing and on reading the written word activates which hemisphere of the brain? Do you want to make a guess? The left hemisphere of the brain, which is logical. I always think of it left, logical, linear, okay? Now, the right hemisphere of the brain is activated when we are in communion, when we are in community, when we are touching, when we are hugging, when we are holding a newborn, holding our beloved, looking at a sunset. So the part of our brain that was in ancient non-writing cultures was activated was the part of the brain that helps us to feel the anima mundi in all, in our brother, in our sister, in that animal, in that insect. The Alphabet versus the Goddess is written by Dr. Leonard Schlein, who was a neurosurgeon who operated on the nerves of the brain. And he was also a traveler. And he was fascinated when he began traveling all over the Middle East and found in museums all of these depictions, like the ones we have up here, of the divine worshipped as female. And what he began to research and study and then write about is the fact that before patriarchy, when the divine was worshipped as female, when that partnering paradigm existed, there was no culture that went to war with each other for their beliefs. Why? Thinking back into the realm of the water, the realm of emotions. Why did we not kill each other for our beliefs back when we were non-writing oral cultures? What part of the brain? Think about the brain again. What he realized is that when we're using mostly the right hemisphere of the brain, our awareness is not just here in our heads. Where else is it?
In our heart.
It's in our hearts. It's in our hearts. We're in feel. We can feel each other. People couldn't manipulate you. Why? Because you could feel their motives. You knew. You could see the physical, tangible body, but you could feel so much more than that. And so there just wasn't, there's no evidence that any of these matriarchal cultures had the situation that we have today, where people are killing each other for their beliefs. What happens when you introduce the alphabet in culture after culture, and that's what his book is. The first part of the book he kind of introduces, and then the last 2/3 of the book, he takes you culture across culture around the world and gives you evidence that when the alphabet was introduced to those cultures, within sometimes 20, but often as long as 100 years, they were killing for their beliefs. So okay, so I get it, the right hemisphere of the brain, when that's active, like I'm in my heart, and I have kinder, more compassionate feelings toward others, but what difference does that really make on a daily basis? Anybody want to? So we have a relationship with different aspects of ourselves. How many of you have ever experienced that it's easier to have compassion for someone else who's messing up or not being perfect in the way they're showing up, but harder to have compassion for yourself? Anybody? Yeah. So when we're in feel, we're also going to have the capacity to have compassion for ourselves. And from that place of compassion, when we're beating ourselves up, it's like we're driving the vehicle of our lives with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake, right? Because, you know, we're trying to go someplace and get something done, and we're criticizing ourselves. And it's like taking that foot off the brake. In ancient times, how many of you have heard the term Magdalene before? How many of you know that's not a name, or it didn't used to be a name? The term Magdalene means high priestess. So in ancient times, whatever culture, whatever country, in your community, there were priestesses. There were priests and there were priestesses. And if you experienced a grief or a loss, what would immediately happen? Because everybody else around you was in feel. Were you grieving by yourself? No. You were grieving in community. And if there was ever a loss or a betrayal that was difficult to integrate, that was difficult to feel all the way through, and it was easy maybe to go into shame and feel like you had to hide, the Magdalene, the high priestess, was there to help you with a group of your closest beloveds to integrate that betrayal or that loss, so that it became a part of you. It became a part of your integrity. And you became known as someone who carried the medicine of having gone through that loss or that betrayal. So let's move into the mental aspect. And in our way of teaching, the air element governs the mental aspect. So one of the things that to me is so precious about the air element is that the air we breathe was breathed by our ancestors and will be breathed by our descendants long, long after we're gone. So when I breathe in, I tend to think I'm breathing in little bits of stardust and little bits of my ancestors in those air molecules. So how many of you have been to Hawaii? If I go to Hawaii, because I'm white, I'm going to be called a name. Does anybody?
Haole.
Haole, yes. Does anybody know what the word haole means?
Doesn't breathe.
Yes. Haole means one who does not breathe. Why? And why do white people who go to Hawaii get called that? Well, in ancient times, the Hawaiian Huna had a very well-developed, beautiful, loving, spiritual tradition. And when the Christian missionaries came to convert them to Christianity, they were so respectful. And they sat down and they, prepared a space for the Christian missionaries to speak to them, and they were all attentive. And the missionaries laid down their Bible and opened it up and began preaching. And the Huna looked at each other, confused. Haole? Haole? One who does not breathe. Because, as a part of their spiritual tradition, before there was any preaching, before there was any thinking, they wanted to make sure that everyone was operating with all mental cylinders. So stand up and we're going to do what the Hawaiian Huna used to do. So you're going to have to stagger yourselves because we don't want you to bump your neighbors with this. So you can't be right next to your neighbors and do this. So this is what they did. They would stand in unison at the beginning of a service, and they would raise their hands on the inhale and lower them in 3 counts on the exhale. Now as you lower your hands this time, think to yourself, mind, body, spirit. Really get that inhale going all the way up. Fill the lungs to capacity. Exhale all the way out as you come down. One more. Great, thank you for playing. So if we did 10 or 15 minutes of that at the beginning of every service, we would not just be breathing in unison, we would be completely oxygenated, and we would be ready to hear what the wise shaman had to tell us. One of the most sacred experiences, I've sat at the feet of many indigenous elders in my life, and about 5 years ago, I participated in the Ancient Wisdom Rising Conference, and was able to meet and sit at the feet of many, many elders from all over the world. My very favorite was a man from he was an Inuit from the islands off the coast of Alaska. His name was Ilarion, which I finally learned how to pronounce, but he would just, if people didn't get it, he would just say, just call me Larry. But yeah, he taught us so much wisdom. But the one piece that I want to share with you is that in his tribe, and they lived on this small island, and As a baby was born, that baby would stay with the mother until weaning and toilet training, until the baby was between 2 and 3 years old. And then a wise elder was chosen, a grandfather, the medicine man, the grandmother, the medicine woman, the shamaness, someone that that child related to. And then the child would go live for a time with that wise elder. And in their culture, language was considered dangerous. Not just written language, not just writing, not just activating the left hemisphere of the brain writing, but actual verbal words. And so, as you raised the child, there were no words exchanged. I want you to think about that for just a moment. The actual word in their language for the word language, the actual word, which I can't pronounce, I won't even try, means dangerous. Because they believed so strongly in the purity and the sovereignty of a child's consciousness that they refrained from speaking to the child out of fear of indoctrinating the child with their words, with their own experience. So imagine for just a moment sitting at the feet of a man who was raised when he described at one point, he was 5 or 6, and he was allowed at that age to go by himself to the cliffs and to watch the birds, because this island was a place of migration for these many species of birds, all different kinds of species. And he was allowed to go by himself and climb the cliffs and watch the birds. And he came back from the cliffs one day and he spoke to his grandfather. He asked a question. And the question was, how is it that all these different species of birds are flying so quickly around each other and there's never an accident, they don't ever crash into each other? And the grandfather spoke back. And he said, go back and watch and come tell me. He was there for 6 hours. And when he came back, he said, I know. It's because the birds, like us, are in feel with each other. They can feel where the other is going to be. So just imagine what it would be like to be in an environment where other people's consciousness was considered so sovereign that when you needed to impart wisdom, it was a transmission of embodiment without indoctrination. So I want to speak a little bit to the fire element, which is about the intuitive realm, the realm of passion. When we live with all of our senses open, there's nothing we can do to stop that sixth sense from activating. But when you're shut down for any reason, whether it's, you're not quite comfortable in your body, or you're not quite comfortable in your environment, when you're shut down for any reason, all of the senses dim, and this is cut off. So if we had been raised in a matrifocal culture, we would have, everyone around us would have seemed so vibrant, so alive, as we would have felt as well. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the center, what we call spirit. And I mean it I mean spirit in a different way than we have come to think of it. The first song that we sang, which thank you, Asha, for choosing that song, do you remember the words, Mother of Darkness, Mother of Light? What do you think that could mean? Day and night? No. Well, yes. And it means something way more than that. So many of us in patriarchy, like myself as a Mormon, I was trying so hard to be a good Molly Mormon, to strive for perfection. There was actually a program that probably still exists in the Young Women program when I turned 12 that I got to participate in called the Pursuit of Excellence. So it doesn't matter what Judeo-Christian faith you're a part of, it's all about perfecting yourself. It's all about being perfect. It's all about living in the light. And I think in New Age or New Thought, we tend to err in that as well. And when we explore the archetypes of the goddess, for those of you who've looked at Kali, you'll see some that are frightening. You'll see some that are dark. The goddess Inanna, who was worshipped in the Middle East during the times of the Old Testament. She was the goddess, supposedly the great goddess that all these other archetypes come from. The goddess Inanna made a descent into the underworld, and her myth replays out in the sky with the Venus. Those times are for your learning and growth, but only if you surrender to them. Only if you allow yourself to be taken. Only if you allow yourself, like the snake wiggles out of a too small skin, wiggle out of an old identity. Only if you're willing to explore the shadow aspect of yourself that you really don't want anyone else to see, because you don't like looking at it yourself. It's just so awful. And the more authentic we can be with the shadow aspect of ourself, the more in feel we can be with each other, the more real we can be with each other, because we've all got the shadow. And the mother is there with us in that darkness, in those dark times. So the embodiment of the divine feminine doesn't always look perfect. It doesn't always look pretty. In our culture, in our way of thinking about religion or spirituality, we are taught that spirit is up there. Spirit ascends. But the soul is down here as well. The soul descends and ascends. So those of us who are comfortable up and down the spectrum, that's juicy. That's awesome. That's where we want to go. And so those are just some of the ways that the divine, embodying these aspects of the divine feminine can make a difference for you. How many of you women are priestesses or high priestesses? Stand up if you will. So for those of you who have questions about, well, what is it actually like to be a priestess, to be a high priestess, ask one of us after the service. Thank you all. All right.